Right, let's get started. Unlike you, I have the list of all of you people, and I think it speaks both to the knowledge and expertise of our speaker and the topic that she's chosen to address us on, that we've got both a good and a high-powered audience. So lots of experts, both on the platform but in the audience. Alanoud Al-Sharekh is my colleague and a friend and the corresponding senior fellow for regional politics at the IISS office in Manama. She conducts research on regional and global security as well as geo-economic issues, and before we were lucky enough to hire her, she was a senior political analyst at the Kuwaiti National Security Bureau, also a gender politics consultant for the UNDP, amongst others, and also is extremely well educated because she's got a master's and a PhD from the same place as me, the School of Oriental and African Studies. So Alanoud will speak for about 20 minutes or half an hour, and then we'll have questions and answers afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toby. That's a very kind introduction. And I'm aware, ladies and gentlemen, that I've picked a topic that might be a bit complicated and sensitive. So I'm going to try and break it down to its most basic components as I see them. And I urge you, if I am guilty of oversimplification, then please take me to task in the question and answer session, because I know if you don't, Toby will. So what the Arab Spring has done is that it's split our region into two very distinct categories. Regimes which were capable of reacting swiftly to the tide of anger and reform demands, and those who, for a variety of reasons, couldn't react quickly and were not able to stem the escalation of violence and eventually had to succumb to the change. It has also split the Arab people into two distinct camps. Those who were desperate enough to risk their lives to bring about a change in the ruling system so that they could have a hope of a better future, and those who might have been miserable but were not so hopeless that they were induced into this protracted and violent engagement with the entrenched regime system. The failure of dynastic republics over the past year should not be taken to mean the success of a monarchy-based one. What it reflects is that the Arab people no longer have the patience to tolerate purely dynastic rule. The GCC countries in general reacted to the events of the Arab Spring by introducing a program of fiscal packages. They raised salaries, they initiated economic programs of development, housing, future job creation, unemployment benefits, etc. But an economic package can only give you short-term stability. It does not ensure long-term prosperity, which is definitely in the interest of a monarch who is in it for the long haul more than an elected government head. The Arab Spring has taught us that economic solutions do not provide sufficient answers for the appetite for reform that the Arab people have developed. If that was the case, Libya would have survived and Jordan would have crumbled. So the regimes that have managed to find themselves still standing after uprisings arrived on their doorsteps are, in general, those that recognize that young people in the region today are questioning patriarchal norms in their own households, and they are questioning patriarchal norms in the authority figures that govern them. Jordan and Morocco's monarchy survived demonstrations because they were able to instantaneously react to the anger on the street. Prime ministers were dismissed, cabinets were reshuffled, election dates were set, concessions were made. Now, in actual fact, the rulers of Morocco and Jordan have not ceded a great deal of their power to the people, but their ability to adapt and to enter into a dialogue has meant that negotiations took a more peaceful route. So Arab monarchies have seen how swiftly their people can shed monarchies. They have seen it happen in Iraq. They have seen it happen in Egypt. They have seen it happen in Syria, often with disastrous consequences. So the monarchy's ability to react to public anger and adapt is the reason behind its survival. When we talk about the appetite for reform in the GCC and elsewhere, we are talking about economic reform, political reform, and security sector reform, fueled by demographic factors that are shared throughout the region. But I think it is pointless to talk about reform in these areas without speaking about the need for leadership reform. And in the GCC, that means that we have to reform the ruling families. This is not a new concept. Monarchies in the GCC have survived through renegotiating the terms of contract between the ruler and the ruled. The system of patronage that exists today in the GCC, whereby the leadership subsidizes the lifestyle of those they rule, is new. Before the discovery of oil, many of the GCC's ruling families were supported financially by merchant elites. The continued peaceful existence of monarchy rule in the GCC faces a number of threats and challenges. Two of those are threats that the Arab Spring have proved are across the region, and two of those are unique to the GCC monarchy-based system of rule. The first is that all Arab regimes suffered from optimism bias. They could not conceive that the risks that applied to others applied to them as well. So when Tunis exploded, the leadership in Egypt and Western analysts who should have known better said that Egypt was exempt. When Libya imploded, Bashar al-Assad did a very fancy interview in the Wall Street Journal explaining just why Syria was not facing the same danger. In the GCC, our leadership congratulated themselves that events in Yemen couldn't happen on their turf, but they did. Protests landed on our doorstep. So the Arab Spring teaches us that no one is exempt from the need to change. The second factor that becomes apparent across the board is the rise of political Islam. And it is a very different animal than radical Islam. Political Islam gains victory through ballot boxes. It has a different kind of legitimacy. And it is clearly the greatest victor today in the events following Arab Spring regime upheaval. GCC leadership has to be very careful to not let political Islam be the route that their citizens choose in order to access a greater share of the decision-making process, like they have done elsewhere. The other two factors unique to the GCC monarchies are ones that perhaps other monarchies have faced over time, and therefore they may be inevitable. One, the horizontal expansion of the ruling family itself. They are increasing in number, and with that, there is a distortion of the power flow, even in systems where there is a clear primogeniture line. Members of the ruling family are forming power clusters within it. Now, this causes problems in decision-making, it causes problems in accountability, and it reinforces a sense of distorted or weak rule. The second are succession issues. There can't be murky planning for who takes over the leadership of a GCC monarchy. The longevity of rulers is not essentially a problem in and of itself. Warren Buffett is 81, and he still does a good job of guiding Berkshire Hathaway. The problem with the longevity of the GCC rulers is that it creates problems within the coming generation. Infighting within family members is polarizing the leadership system in the GCC. And it is a greater threat to its peaceful existence than a popular revolt. Changes in administration in GCC monarchies tend to come from within. Sultan Qaboos of Oman replaced his father. The Emir of Qatar replaced his father. His father, in turn, had replaced a cousin. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia replaced King Saud. So your family, as a GCC ruler, are your first constituents, and they can be dangerous and powerful enemies if one does not manage the leadership model well. But the appeasement and continued compromise within ruling family members is creating problems of leadership. And I don't know how much longer succession planning can remain an in-house decision. I think that in future, the populations of the GCC are going to demand a say in who gets to rule them, as they did before, because the majority of ruling families in the GCC rule through a consensus project. It is not all bad news. GCC monarchies have wealth and privilege other regimes only dream of. Unencumbered by party politics or the need for referendums, they can push through changes quickly and decisively. We have examples of charismatic and visionary leaders in the GCC. The leadership of Dubai managed to change a backwater desert town into an international hotspot. Qatar's leadership has managed to get a huge international platform for a tiny country. It has given new dimensions to the term soft power. Domestically, a GCC monarch can take unpopular decisions for the better good. The late Emir of Kuwait decided in 2005 that there has to be a concentrated push towards the inclusion of women into the political process, in spite of the fact that 70% of the Kuwaiti population did not think that this was a priority or important. Our monarchy can afford to push through unpopular decisions. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia also made very bold decisions in initiating a co-educational program in Saudi Arabia. But they must also not be afraid to be unpopular within their own families. They must also be able to reform the ruling family so that it can continue to survive and lead. And it's possible. If there is strong leadership at the top, you can decide to curb the worst excesses of royal family members. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, when he took over, he initiated a program of restricting ruling family privileges. One of the ones that we know about is that he limited their unrestricted access to the national airline. So their relationship with the Saudi Airways changed dramatically. For some people, that seems like a small step, but if you are dealing with people who think of this as their birthright, it is a step in the right direction. I think it's become clear for those who rule and those who are ruled that we need reform and we need it fast. Recently, Kuwait's prime minister was effectively forced to resign by popular demand. This sends a message to the GCC leadership that corrupt and incompetent leadership will no longer be tolerated. So if change does not come from within, it might be forced from without. The majority of the GCC citizens are loyal to their monarchies, and they have emotional ties to them. It is also culturally difficult. There are many inhibitions that limit the appetite for popular revolt. Those who went out on the streets of Sahar last year were eager to stress that they loved Sultan Qaboos, but they were upset with the behavior of the ruling elite around him. We also, in hindsight and after the bloody events of 2011 and the bloody events that we see today in Syria, recognize that popular rule and unrestricted parliamentary systems can be as ruinous as autocratic ones. Regime change, or the appetite for regime change, has been dampened significantly. And we have examples in the GCC, in Iraq, of how a multiplayer, constantly in flux system leads to a political mess and a wasting of resources. The example of Iran across the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, depending on your audience, is a reminder of exactly the kind of Islamic republic we do not want to be in the GCC. So reforming monarchies is a long process, but it needs to be done. And like in Europe, we have examples in the GCC of ruling families coming back by popular demand. After the liberation of Kuwait, the Al-Sabah family came back because the population of Kuwait wanted them back. But the population of Kuwait has also forced them to re-examine their system and may force them to change some of their practices. So we are hopeful as GCC citizens and as intellectuals and civil society groups that the leadership of the GCC can recognize that it needs to evolve the same way that its citizenship is evolving. Thank you.
Right, I have a few questions, but I'll leave them and let the audience get it. I think we've been given a few startling images. Optimism bias, which is my favourite, the difference between political Islam and radical Islam, and the power clusters in ruling families that need to reform. So who would like to ask the first question? Yes, sir.
Ben Barry from the Institute. Is the Shia-Sunni confessional divide a factor?
Am I answering questions on a one-to-one basis? Yes. Yeah. The short answer is, of course. The sectarian issue, I mean, it has its root, as you know, in the Iraq-Iran conflict. But the fact that a lot of the members of the Iraq army at the time were Shiites did not stop them fighting with Iranians and giving up their life to protect their country. The problem is the expansion of Iran's hegemonistic ambitions in the area has aroused a great deal of paranoia, not only on the leadership level, but within the populations. And that's unfortunate, because once you enter into a sectarian dialogue, it is very difficult to extract yourself from it. And we're seeing this play out. The website of the British monarchy lists the role of the monarch as a unifying symbol. So it is hoped that our GCC monarchs can also provide, if you like, an icon of unity for us, because we have seen the Lebanese example of descending into sectarian and ethnic motivated popular rule, and it's a disaster. So if we can find a symbol of stability and unity that transcends sectarian issues, and some GCC monarchies have done an excellent job of maintaining that, then hopefully we can weather the storm. But I don't think that this Sunni Shiite issue is something that's going to go away anytime soon.
Well, I have three questions on the front, and we'll start with Frank and then work our way down.
Frank Gardner, BBC security correspondent, former Gulf correspondent. Thanks very much, Dr. Alanoud. That was really interesting. You set out very clearly where you think the stress points are and how certain people are dealing with them now. But I'd be very interested to know what your thoughts are as to how this is going to play out over the next 10 to 20 years. Because one ruler said to me recently, if we're going to survive, we will have to be very different in 20 years' time. Where do you see it going? Do you see a kind of parliamentary democracy? Do you see them becoming effectively republics or kind of constitutional monarchies where they almost take a back seat? How is it going to play out? Is it going to be violent or is it going to be peaceful? Sorry, a lot of questions in there, but...
Yes. Okay, well, I'll start with the thing that I have an emotional response to. So republics, God no, because historically those have been failures in the Arab world so far. So what I'm hoping, and I don't have a crystal ball, but what I'm hoping is going to happen is what you just spoke about, that the need for reforming the ruling system is recognized and action becomes immediate. But what we have learned is that it is very difficult to convince those who have power of the need to share it, and it's very difficult, even more so, if not impossible, to convince those who want to share the power that they should wait or that they should not engage in destructive action in order to access it. What I think is going to happen realistically is a slow but painful move towards acknowledging that this relatively loose system of access to the privileges of power for a great number of members of royal and ruling families is going to change very drastically over the next 10 and 20 years. It needs to change in order for the monarchy to survive. But the act of convincing current players that they're not going to have a role in the future is going to be a painful one. But we have seen some of the more youthful monarchies try to introduce systems to make this negotiation less painful. Saudi Arabia's Allegiance Council is an example of that. It's trying to come up with a point-by-point strategy of which of King Abdulaziz's grandchildren is more suitable to rule Saudi Arabia. I believe that in future, it will no longer simply be an in-house decision. They will need to have either a popular referendum or some sort of mechanism to include popular feelings.
So.
Hi, I'm George Lambrakis. I'm a diplomat, retired American, as you can guess, with service in the Middle East. You gave a very good presentation on the sort of the steady things going on. And I'm just wondering if it's not an optimistic bias on your part, because we're seeing a number of things happening in the area, and I'd like your comment to the extent you want. First, there's the issue of Qatar, in which the ruler is trying to play a very big game on both sides of every issue. Then there's the issue in Saudi Arabia of money going to Al-Qaeda, as we think is going, still going to the Taliban, to all kinds of people. Is the ruling family able to do anything with the financial backers, perhaps? At this point, I don't think they need financial backers from the merchants in the area. So what is happening there, and what would happen, and what would be dangerous among these things? Let's move beyond sort of the beginning, which you very well set out. Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, I'm trying to understand the structure of your question. You posed a question about Qatar's play for world dominance and terrorism finance, right? Okay. So I think Qatar is a very interesting case. It has lots of money. I can't say that enough, and I think everybody knows that. Also, it has a tiny population, not small, tiny population. It also has a very lucky monarchy in that because it's very, very rich and there are very, very few people who are Qatari, enjoys a generally jovial relationship with its population. Qatar went through something of a real estate bubble in 2009. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the answer was very simply, the government would buy back all the real estate projects. People were happy, they didn't lose any money, let's continue. So it's very difficult for me to talk about Qatar with the rules that apply for other people. Qatar is an exception. It can afford to take any position on foreign policy at any time because it is not burdened by the need to be reined in by sort of a GCC consensus, whereas other monarchies need the GCC consensus for financial reasons, for security reasons, etc. So Qatar is a satellite on its own, and God bless them, that's all I can say. Yeah, as long as their population is happy, that's Qatar. When it comes to terrorism finance, this was a very, very serious issue. And I think it's well acknowledged that leadership in our part of the world and the leadership in this part of the world were not aware of how dangerous radical Islam can be. I think that over the past decade has been rectified a great deal. And there's been systematic financial controls to try and limit the amount of funds that exit the GCC and goes into various accounts of terrorist-leaning, let's say, Islamic charities, etc. It's a very difficult process to control because it does come under the guise of philanthropy in many cases, but everyone is now aware of this fact and is trying systematically to break down the ideological groupings that feed into it, which I think is more important than the financing.
Just wanted to push you on both Qatar and Saudi's attitude towards Syria. I mean, there's a joke in there about Turkey's voting for Christmas, but that's not the way I'm going to go. What does Qatar and Saudi want from Syria? And what's the outcome do you think they're playing for?
Well, I think it's very clear that Saudi and Qatar will not be satisfied by any overtures that the current regime is going to do to try and mend the damage to their credibility. In the case of Yemen, Saudi was instrumental in brokering, I can't actually call it a peaceful exit, but a less bloody and protracted exit for Ali Abdullah Saleh, which was no easy task. In the case of Syria, the Saudis, from what I understand, were approached by the Russians. They were in negotiations with them to try and organize a similar passage for Bashar al-Assad. There was talk in Beirut a while ago about the head of the regime and his family perhaps relocating to Russia, since the Russians seem to be fans. So the problem with that, of course, is that Saudi and Qatar do not have as much influence on Syria as they do in Yemen, because Iran is in the picture. And Iran does not want a change of regime in Syria.
Right, there are two questions down here, but in the interest, I'm not forgotten you gentlemen, but I'll go here, take two from here first.
Thank you very much. My name is Christian Henderson. I'm a political analyst. I've got two questions, if I may. First of all, there are some rumors going around that a closer union between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia may be announced later this year. I'm just wondering if you could shed any light on that rumor. Secondly, perhaps the biggest economic unsustainability in the region is Saudi Arabia in terms of rising unemployment, rising fiscal spending, but yet a lower amount of money that's accrued from oil sales due to a rising expenditure on energy production. And I was just wondering how the Saudi government may be developing strategies to deal with that, if indeed they can develop a strategy to deal with that. Thank you.
Nobody asks easy questions. Now, you asked me a three-part question, right? So first I'm going to answer you with regards to the rumor. We've all heard of this rumor, what was it called, a confederation, or it had some words like that, a union between Bahrain and Saudi. I doubt that it will happen because it's not necessary. That's simple. They don't need a formal union. They already have a very high level of support and cooperation. Secondly, your question was about the financial status of Saudi Arabia, right? Am I missing a question in the middle?
Basically, how they're going to cope with rising unemployment, yet a lower fiscal, an increased fiscal spending with this, this report that went out about the fact that they've had less money to play with because they're spending so much money on producing energy through the oil-based power stations.
Okay. Well, I think the study that you're talking about is with regards to domestic consumption of oil. Saudi has a real problem with national domestic consumption. I think it's as high as 2 million barrels per day, which would be about 20% of production. So that is a problem, and they are trying really hard to deal with it. They also have a problem with, they don't have enough gas, so they might need to purchase that. However, when Libya's production stopped, Saudi Arabia stepped up its production from about 8.7 to 10 million barrels per day, and it did it almost instantaneously. And Saudi Arabia has already said that it can raise production to 11 million barrels per day to make up for Iran's deficit. So the ability of Saudi Arabia to raise its output, I think, will cover any fiscal shortcomings that come from increased domestic consumption in the short term. In the long term, it might be a problem. Besides that, the demographic issues facing Saudi Arabia in terms of finding employment for its young people and in terms of a rising demand for a certain quality of life and standards of living is not unique to Saudi Arabia. It's across the GCC, and it is also across the Arab region. So the difference lies in the ability to do something about it. And so Saudi Arabia has a history of meticulous planning for the future. Granted, there are problems with corruption, there are problems with application, with follow-through. However, they are moving in the right direction. The problem in Saudi Arabia is not simply a one of creating jobs for its young people. It's also about integrating women into the workplace. It's about changing the judiciary so that contracts can be held through. And we have seen reforms in that direction. So in terms of future planning, Saudi has a very impressive and extensive schedule. And it has a 5-year plan that gets reviewed and readjusted. And it doesn't look like we're going to find another energy source anytime soon. So I think the Saudis are okay for the next 10 years.
And behind you there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Oleg. I'm a student at King's College. My question is a two-part question, and it has to do more not with internal dynamics within the GCC, but the foreign policy of the GCC countries. And the first one is there a unified policy, foreign policy to the GCC countries? And the second one is, if there is one, what is that policy towards Iraq, and how they're trying to influence Iraq, and whether they're still thinking about possibly incorporating Iraq into the GCC in the future? Thank you.
Okay, incorporating any new countries into the GCC would require changing the GCC charter. It has not been done yet, and I doubt that it's going to be done in future, but things may change. What has been done in the past is some countries are given observer status, or they are included in some general aspects of GCC cooperation. I think at some point Iraq was part of the GCC Soccer Cup. And the history that some GCC countries have with Iraq and the continued demarcation issues with the border, I think will prevent a serious consideration of including it in the GCC anytime soon. However, in terms of unified foreign policy, it will all depend on circumstance. The foreign policy towards the American and Israeli position on Palestine, for example, is unified. When it comes to foreign policy with Iran, there can be disparities. And when it comes to what they should do about Iraq, I'm not quite sure anyone knows the answer to that. I'm not sure that the continuous change at the top of the Iraqi leadership and the quite obvious Iranian intervention is helpful to having a unified foreign policy towards Iraq, because the players are continually changing. So with that, attitudes and foreign policy decisions towards Iraq are changing too. But I think that there's regret that the political vacuum that was created when Saddam was removed from power was not better managed by GCC states.
Thanks. Thank you for your patience, Stefan.
I'm Sajid Ali Khan, member here. I'd almost forgotten what I was going to ask. How do you view the fact that these, you call them the Gulf monarchies, in fact, these are more or less the old trucial states, aren't they? And they're little emirates, really. And it's only, as you say, the money from the oil which has changed things a bit. Do you see any way that they could follow the only feasible solution is to have some sort of constitutional monarchy? I mean, all the rebellions from French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, they got rid of their monarchs. And so on. Iraq, of course, did in 1958, as you know. But the only other thing I would ask you is, you said Arab uprisings. In fact, it was a true revolution in Tunis, wasn't it? And it was quick. That's why there was no interference from the usual two delinquent states, England and France. I think I'll leave it at that. The constitutional monarchy is the main thing. If you see any way forward, because they're not going to be able to continue as they are.
Okay. I'm really not a fan of the term constitutional monarchy. Just to let you know, we already have constitutional monarchies in the GCC. Kuwait is officially a constitutional monarchy. Bahrain is officially a constitutional monarchy. You can have a constitution and a monarch. It doesn't mean that you are essentially or completely democratic, right? Jordan and Morocco are both examples of this system, and in them, the king is still head of state, head of the security forces, and head of government. So I don't like the idea of constitutional monarchy being the solution to all our ills, because it obviously isn't. The Moroccans now, after the latest election, have introduced a new political term into the lexicon. They talk about democratic monarchies. So that is actually, I think, a more substantial term than. Yeah, but essentially, England has a monarch who is the head of the nation, right? And then it has a prime minister who is the head of the government. And no constitution, exactly. So I don't know how it's a constitutional monarchy, but there you are. But I think it doesn't matter what we call it, as long as there is a consensus and the citizens are happy, right? And it suits their purpose. Now, Mudawir Rashid has mentioned that for the GCC especially, there is a problem with the term constitutional monarchy, in which, as you said, there's an elected prime minister. Now, she argues that in Islamic Sharia, the bay'ah, which is the vow of allegiance, cannot happen to a ruler who doesn't actually rule. So I think it's a good thing that we don't go around adopting this phrase and the idea of an elected prime minister without studying very closely what it's going to mean to the rise of political Islam.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alanoud. Hosni Imam, Kuwait, Egypt. I just have two issues to raise with you. The first, regarding the invasion of Kuwait, exposed in a very glaring way the deficiency and the vulnerability of the defense mechanism in the GCC. And I believe in terms of the reform system that should be applied, this should be looked at very carefully. The second point, to come back to democratization, to the participation, I believe there is a very good example of how the Emir of Kuwait was actually partly chosen by the participation of the National Assembly when this happened 4 or 5 years ago or so. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Yes, I think it's you know, common knowledge that the GCC states rely on Western powers for their security architecture. Now, they can try to amend that, and the response has been to try and organize a greater cooperation within security apparatus systems in the GCC. But I don't see how the GCC states will be able to stand, you know, from a security perspective against neighbors who are more populous and who are better equipped in military terms than their own. So I don't see that changing. The glaring inefficiencies were made clear. They are trying to you know, make the best of what they have, but their geography won't be changed. They still live next to dangerous neighbors, and they're still not as militarily inclined as others in the region, in spite of procurement. Now, procurement is a different issue. I'm not going to get into that. And as far as the Emir of Kuwait, you know, accessing power through consensus via the National Assembly, that's a good point. But I think this is going to be the trend for the future. We're going to see much more popular intervention in who gets to lead in the GCC in terms of monarchs. And to go back to your point, sir, job security for a monarch is not always a bad thing as the head of government. I mean, when you have elected prime ministers like you do in this country and in other places worrying about where they're going to go next, that also puts you in a position where you have to compromise and you have to think about things. John Major was in Kuwait representing a European bank recently. Tony Blair was a consultant on a project in Kuwait. You know, he was paid handsomely for that. So, you know, it does actually, even if you're elected, it does color, not having job security in the future, it does color some of your choices. So we must be aware of the pros and cons and, you know, keep that in the back of our mind.
Thank you. Yes, sir. No.
Thank you very much. Frank Rusagara from Rwanda High Commission. If I may take you back to the drawing board, please. What are some of the irreconcilable differences that engender the violent relations between the Shiite and the Sunni communities in the Gulf states? Some of the irreconcilable differences that engender the violent relations between the two communities in the respective states. Thank you.
Where does the divide come from?
Where does the divide come from? Your question is, where does the divide come from?
Yeah, the irreconcilable differences that engender the equal violent relations between the communities, the Shiites and the Sunni in the Gulf states.
Well, okay, well, I mean, essentially the difference between the Sunnis and the Shiites is one in religious dogma, right? But I don't think your question is about the difference in the dogma. Is it? The difference, I think the most important difference between citizens in the GCC boils down to socioeconomics. And the GCC today is not unique in that. At Davos recently, the major topic was economic inequality and social injustice. So the Shiites and Sunnis in the GCC are both concerned with issues of social justice and economic equality. And in the GCC, you're not talking about the 1%, you're talking about the 0.01%. So it's a very different structure. However, the majority of the GCC leadership is Sunni, and they rule over people who are both Sunni and Shiite. And some of the grievances of our Shiite communities is that they are not included in enough of the security apparatus. Some of their grievances are also to do with systematic and institutional discriminations against them. I hope that answers your question.
You sit at the back.
My name is Abdullah Hamouda. I'm a journalist. There appears to be a commonly held idea, especially amongst the Gulf rulers, that when you reach the position of a ruler, whether a king or a king president, you will not be allowed to fall from that. And the departure from the post has to be as easy as possible, unless there is a personal animosity, as was in the case of Gaddafi. And this appeared to play in the case of Mubarak, when there was a pressure from some Gulf rulers to release Mubarak to go somewhere else and not take him to court. How do you see that reflecting on the perception of Gulf rulers in terms of the accountability of the ruler and the prospect of that in the future? The other point I'd like to raise is related to the finance which goes from Gulf countries to the Salafis in other countries. And one may see the Salafis as radical Islam but non-violent, and who do not issue fatwa of uprising against the ruler, but when they find a vacuum, they use political Islam in order to go to power and have a share of it. Do you think that this point can backfire back home in the Gulf?
I think the rise of political Islam, Salafist or otherwise, is a threat to all the systems that have survived the Arab Spring so far. So I think it's something that the leadership in the GCC are well aware of. But as I told you, there's a limit to how much you can support systems in other countries, and there's a limit to how conservative your attitudes towards the familiar can be before they turn against you. So this is a problem that we are seeing right now in Kuwait. The latest elections were a victory for an opposition that was a coalition of tribal and Islamist thought. I don't think that the GCC leadership is interested in supporting this sort of political opposition, whether it be Salafist or Muslim Brotherhood or otherwise, because it threatens them on home soil as well. Your first question was a bit difficult for me to follow, so can I ask you to just, yeah.
There was pressure from some Gulf rulers on the Egyptian Supreme Military Council to release Mubarak and not take him to court.
Yes, yes.
They did not like this to happen, and they provide an example, as they don't like the domino effect of the Arab Spring to reach the Gulf. And this is why that kind of settlement with Ali Abdullah Saleh to make it as easy as possible. He was a difficult nut to crack, but at least he has moved. Now, they would like, as it appears, that someone who has reached the position of a head of a state not to be humiliated.
Yes, well, I think it's very clear that the idea that a ruler can be deposed or taken to court or forced to give up his position by popular demand is disturbing to all the Arab leadership, not just the GCC. I'm sure that there would have been efforts to try and find a mechanism for safe passage for Gaddafi as well, had he been willing to speak coherently to anyone about it. I think that with Mubarak, you're right, it might be a more positive personal relationship, but I think that would be the best case scenario as far as the GCC leadership is concerned in every case, and not simply in Hosni Mubarak's case. So if Saudi Arabia or some other country can ensure safe passage for them, it can ensure a less bloody struggle for regime change, that would be more reassuring, I think, for GCC leadership than what is happening today in Syria or what happened to Gaddafi.
And the final question to my colleague, Mark Fitzpatrick.
Thanks, Alanoud. You must feel like you're on the firing line here, so many questions. I have a question about the title, Arab uprisings. I'm just curious, the word uprisings, is that a better term than Arab Spring or Arab awakening? And are some of these terms, loaded? Is there political correctness here?
Well, there was a great deal of political correctness here in the ISS over the title.
Wasn't a planted question. I didn't know that.
Originally, the title of Arab Awakening was suggested to me, and I refused to have it because I find the term reductive and offensive. The suggestion that Arabs were dormant or asleep or unconscious or comatose or whatever it is prior to 2011, negates years of struggle, and it might seem that this happened overnight, but it was a steady evolution. So that's my feeling about Arab Awakening. Besides that, the term has distinct spiritual connotations in Islam, and although the Salafists seem to be the winners right now of the Arab Spring, I'm pretty sure this is not what people mean when they say Arab Awakening. They're not talking about the spiritual enlightenment of the Arab nation. Arab Spring is the term that the Arabs use to describe this phenomena. And being an Arab, talking about the Arabs, I think it makes things easier and clearer to say Arab Spring. However, because of in-house resistance, I compromised and went with Arab uprisings. Because although it might be a revolution in one place, it is not a revolution everywhere. So we can't call them Arab revolutions. You might want them to be revolutions, but they are not yet revolutions. Does that answer your question?
It sure does.
And I think that's an excellent note to end on. So all it's to thank our speaker for an excellent talk.